We're traveling to Tsarist Russia this evening with two stories by classic Russian authors Anton Chekhov and Maxim Gorky. I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. We're going to start with a story by Anton Chekhov. Chekhov was born in 1860 in southern Russia, and he studied to be a doctor and did his writing on the side to help support his impoverished family. He contracted tuberculosis while still in his mid-20s and died of it at the age of 44. This evening I'm reading his story, The Bet, by Anton Chekhov. 1. It was a dark autumn night. The old banker was pacing from corner to corner of his study, recalling to his mind the party he gave in the autumn 15 years before. There were many clever people at the party and much interesting conversation. They talked, among other things, of capital punishment. The guests, among them not a few scholars and journalists, for the most part disapproved of capital punishment. They found it obsolete as a means of punishment, unfitted to a Christian state, and immoral. Some of them thought that capital punishment should be replaced universally by life imprisonment. "I don't agree with you," said the host. "I myself have experienced neither capital punishment nor life imprisonment, but if one might judge a priori, then in my opinion capital punishment is more moral and more humane than imprisonment. Execution kills instantly. Life imprisonment kills by degrees. Who is the more humane executioner? One who kills you in a few seconds, or one who draws the life out of you incessantly for years?" "They're both equally immoral," remarked one of the guests, "because their purpose is the same, to take away life. The state is not God. It has no right to take away that which it cannot give back, if it should so desire." Among the company was a lawyer, a young man of about 25. On being asked his opinion, he said, "Capital punishment and life imprisonment are equally immoral, but if I were offered the choice between them, I would certainly choose the second. It's better to live somehow than not to live at all." There ensued a lively discussion. The banker, who was then younger and more nervous, suddenly lost his temper, banged his fist on the table, and turning to the young lawyer, cried out, "It's a lie! I bet you 2 millions you wouldn't stick in a cell even for 5 years. "If you mean it seriously," replied the lawyer, "then I bet I'll stay not 5, but 15. "15! Done!" cried the banker. "Gentlemen, I stake 2 millions. "Agreed. You stake 2 millions, I my freedom," said the lawyer. So this wild, ridiculous bet came to pass. The banker, who at the time had too many millions to count, spoiled and capricious, was beside himself with rapture. During supper he said to the lawyer jokingly, "Come to your senses, young roan, before it's too late. 2 millions are nothing to me, but you stand to lose 3 or 4 of the best years of your life. I say 3 or 4 because you'll never stick it out any longer. Don't forget either, you unhappy man, that voluntary is much heavier than enforced imprisonment. The idea that you have the right to free yourself at any moment will poison the whole of your life in the cell. I pity you." And now the banker, pacing from corner to corner, recalled all this and asked himself, "Why did I make this bet? What's the good? The lawyer loses 15 years of his life, and I throw away 2 millions. Will it convince people that capital punishment is worse or better than imprisonment for life? No, all stuff and rubbish. On my part, it was the caprice of a well-fed man. On the lawyer's pure greed of gold." He recollected further what happened after the evening party. It was decided that the lawyer must undergo his imprisonment under the strictest observation in a garden wing of the banker's house. It was agreed that during the period he would be deprived of the right to cross the threshold to see living people, to hear human voices, and to receive letters and newspapers. He was permitted to have a musical instrument, to read books, to write letters, to drink wine, and to smoke tobacco. By the agreement he could communicate, but only in silence, with the outside world through a little window specially constructed for this purpose. Everything necessary, books, music, wine, he could receive in any quantity by sending a note through the window. The agreement provided for all the minutest details, which made the confinement strictly solitary, and it obliged the lawyer to remain exactly 15 years from 12 o'clock of November 14th, 1870, to 12 o'clock of November 14th, 1885. The least attempt on his part to violate the conditions, to escape if only for 2 minutes before the time, freed the banker from the obligation to pay him the $2 millions. During the first year of imprisonment, the lawyer, as far as was possible to judge from his short notes, suffered terribly from loneliness and boredom. From his wing day and night came the sound of the piano. He rejected wine and tobacco. Wine, he wrote, excites desires, and desires are the chief foes of a prisoner. Besides, nothing is more boring than to drink good wine alone. And tobacco spoils the air in his room. During the first year, the lawyer was sent books of a light character, novels with a complicated love interest, stories of crime and fantasy, comedies, and so on. In the second year, the piano was heard no longer, and the lawyer asked only for classics. In the fifth year, music was heard again, and the prisoner asked for wine. Those who watched him said that during the whole of that year he was only eating, drinking, and lying on his bed. He yawned often and talked angrily to himself. Books he did not read. Sometimes at nights he would sit down to write. He would write for a long time and tear it all up in the morning. More than once he was heard to weep. In the second half of the sixth year, the prisoner began zealously to study languages, philosophy, and history. He fell on these subjects so hungrily that the banker hardly had time to get books enough for him. In the space of 4 years, about 600 volumes were brought at his requests. It was while that passion lasted that the banker received the following letter from the prisoner. My dear jailer, I am writing these lines in 6 languages. Show them to experts. Let them read them. If they do not find one single mistake, I beg you to give orders to have a gun fired off in the garden. By the noise, I shall know that my efforts have not been in vain. The geniuses of all ages and countries speak in different languages, but in them all burns the same flame. Oh, if you knew my heavenly happiness, now that I can understand them. The prisoner's desire was fulfilled. 2 shots were fired in the garden by the banker's order. Later on, after the 10th year, the lawyer sat immovable before his table and read only the New Testament. The banker found it strange that a man who in 4 years had mastered 600 erudite volumes should have spent nearly a year in reading one book, easy to understand and by no means thick. The New Testament was then replaced by a history of religions and theology. During the last 2 years of his confinement, the prisoner read an extraordinary amount, quite haphazard. Now he would apply himself to the natural sciences, then he would read Byron or Shakespeare. Notes used to come from him in which he asked to be sent at the same time a book on chemistry, a textbook on medicine, a novel, and some treatise on philosophy or theology. He read as though he were swimming in the sea among broken pieces of wreckage, and in his desire to save his life was eagerly grasping one piece after another. 2. The banker recalled all this and thought, tomorrow at 12 o'clock he receives his freedom. Under the agreement, I have to pay him $2 millions. If I pay, it's all over with me. I am ruined forever. 15 years before, he had too many millions to count, but now he was afraid to ask himself what he had more of, money or debts. Gambling on the stock exchange, risky speculation, and the recklessness of which he could not rid himself, even in old age, had gradually brought his business to decay. And the fearless, self-confident, proud man of business, he had become an ordinary banker, trembling at every rise and fall of the market. That cursed bet, murmured the old man, clutching his head in despair. Why didn't the man die? He's only 40 years old. He will take away my last farthing, marry, enjoy life, gamble on the exchange, and I will look on like an envious beggar and hear the same words from him every day. I'm obliged to you for the happiness of my life. Let me help you. No, it's too much. The only escape from bankruptcy and disgrace is that the man should die. The clock had just struck 3. The banker was listening. In the house, everyone was asleep, and one could hear only the frozen trees whining outside the windows. Trying to make no sound, he took out of his safe the key to the door, which had not been opened for 15 years, put on his overcoat, and went out of the house. The garden was dark and cold. It was raining. A damp, penetrating wind howled in the garden and gave the trees no rest. Though he strained his eyes, the banker could see neither the ground, nor the white statues, nor the garden wing, nor the trees. Approaching the garden wing, he called the watchman twice. There was no answer. Evidently the watchman had taken shelter from the bad weather and was now asleep somewhere in the kitchen or the greenhouse. If I have the courage to fulfill my intention, thought the old man, the suspicion will fall on the watchman first of all. In the darkness he groped for the steps and the door and entered the hall of the garden wing, then poked his way into a narrow passage and struck a match. Not a soul was there. Someone's bed with no bedclothes in it stood there, and an iron stove loomed dark in the corner. The seals on the door that led into the prisoner's room were unbroken. When the match went out, the old man, trembling from agitation, peeped into the little window. In the prisoner's room, a candle was burning dimly. The prisoner himself sat by the table. Only his back, the hair on his head, and his hands were visible. Open books were strewn about on the table, the 2 chairs, and on the carpet near the table. 5 minutes passed, and the prisoner never once stirred. 15 years' confinement had taught him to sit motionless. The banker tapped on the window with his finger, but the prisoner made no movement in reply. Then the banker cautiously tore the seals from the door and put the key into the lock. The rusty lock gave a hoarse groan, and the door creaked. The banker expected instantly to hear a cry of surprise and the sound of steps. 3 minutes passed, and it was as quiet inside as it had been before. He made up his mind to enter. Before the table sat a man, unlike an ordinary human being. It was a skeleton, with tight-drawn skin, with long curly hair like a woman's, and a shaggy beard. The color of his face was yellow, of an earthy shade. The cheeks were sunken, the back long and narrow, and the hand upon which he leaned his hairy head was so lean and skinny it was painful to look on. His hair was already silvering with gray, and no one who glanced at the sensible emaciation of the face would have believed that he was only 40 years old. On the table before his bended head lay a sheet of paper on which something was written in a tiny hand. Poor devil, thought the banker. He's asleep and probably seeing millions in his dreams. I have only to take and throw this half-dead thing on the bed, smother him a moment with the pillow, and the most careful examination will find no trace of unnatural death. But first, let us read what he has written here. The banker took the sheet from the table and read, "Tomorrow, at 12 o'clock midnight, I shall obtain my freedom and the right to mix with people. But before I leave this room and see the sun, I think it necessary to say a few words to you. On my own clear conscience, and before God who sees me, I declare to you that I despise freedom, life, health, and all that your books call the blessings of the world. For 15 years I have diligently studied earthly life. True, I saw neither the earth nor the people, but in your books I drank fragrant wine, sang songs, hunted deer and wild boar in the forests, loved women, and beautiful women, like clouds ethereal, created by the magic of your poet's genius, visited me by night and whispered to me wonderful tales, which made my head drunken. In your books I climbed the summits of Elbrus and Mont Blanc, and saw from there how the sun rose in the morning, and in the evening suffused the sky, the ocean, and the mountain ridges with a purple gold. I saw from there how above me lightnings glimmered, cleaving the clouds. I saw green forests, fields, rivers, lakes, cities. I heard sirens singing and playing the pipes of Pan. I touched the wings of beautiful devils who came flying to me to speak of God. In your books I cast myself into bottomless abysses, worked miracles, burned cities to the ground, preached new religions, conquered whole countries. Your books gave me wisdom. All that unwearying human thought created in the centuries is compressed in a little lump in my skull. I know I am cleverer than you all. And I despise your books, despise all worldly blessings and wisdom. Everything is void, frail, visionary, and delusive as a mirage. Though you be proud and wise and beautiful, yet will death wipe you from the face of the earth like the mice underground. And your posterity, your history, and the immortality of your men of genius will be as frozen slag, burnt down together with the terrestrial globe. You are mad and gone the wrong way. You take falsehood for truth and ugliness for beauty. You would marvel if suddenly apple and orange trees should bear frogs and lizards instead of fruit, and if roses should begin to breathe the odor of a sweating horse. So do I marvel at you, who have bartered heaven for earth. I do not want to understand you. That I may show you indeed my contempt for that by which you live, I waive the 2 millions of which I once dreamt of as paradise, and which I now despise. That I may deprive myself of my right to them, I shall come out of here 5 minutes before the stipulated term, and thus shall violate the agreement. When he had read, the banker put the sheets on the table, kissed the head of the strange man, and began to weep. He went out of the wing. Never at any other time, not even after his terrible losses on the exchange, had he felt such contempt for himself as now. Coming home, he lay down on his bed, but agitation and tears kept him a long time from sleeping. The next morning, the poor watchman came running to him and told him that they had seen the man who had lived in the wing climb through the window into the garden. He had gone to the gate and disappeared. The banker instantly went to his servants to the wing and established the escape of his prisoner. To avoid unnecessary rumors, he took the paper with the renunciation from the table and, on his return, locked it in his safe. The end. So my second story this evening is by Maxim Gorky. Gorky was born in 1868 and was orphaned when he was 11. His hardships early in life fired him with anger and compassion at the situation of the most vulnerable people in Russian society. The story I'm reading this evening is Her Lover by Maxim Gorky. An acquaintance of mine once told me the following story. When I was a student at Moscow, I happened to live alongside one of those ladies whose repute is questionable. She was a Pole, and they called her Teresa. She was a tallish, powerfully built brunette, with black bushy eyebrows and a large, coarse face, as if carved out by a hatchet. The bestial gleam of her dark eyes, her thick bass voice, her cabman-like gait, and her immense muscular vigor, worthy of a fishwife, inspired me with horror. I lived on the top flight, and her garret was opposite to mine. I never left my door open when I knew her to be at home. But this, after all, was a very rare occurrence. Sometimes I chanced to meet her on the staircase or in the yard, and she would smile upon me with a smile which seemed to me sly and cynical. Occasionally I saw her drunk, with bleary eyes, tousled hair, and a particularly hideous grin. On such occasions she would speak to me. "How do you do, Mr. Student?" And her stupid laugh would still further intensify my loathing of her. I should have liked to have changed my quarters in order to have avoided such encounters and greetings. But my little chamber was a nice one, and there was such a wide view from the window, and it was always so quiet in the street below. So I endured. And one morning I was sprawled on my couch, trying to find some sort of excuse for not attending my class, when the door opened and the bass voice of Teresa the Loathsome resounded from my threshold. Good health to you, Mr. Student. What do you want? I said. I saw that her face was confused and supplicatory. It was a very unusual sort of face for her. Sir, I want to beg a favor of you. Will you grant it me? I lay there silent and thought to myself, gracious. Courage, my boy. I want to send a letter home. That's what it is, she said. Her voice was beseeching, soft, timid. Deuce take you, I thought, but up I jumped and sat down at my table, took a sheet of paper and said, Come here, sit down and dictate. She came, sat down very gingerly on a chair, and looked at me with a guilty look. Well, to whom do you want to write? To Boleslav Koshput, at the town of Spielitsana on the Warsaw Road. Well, fire away. My dear Bowles, my darling, my faithful lover, may the Mother of God protect thee. Thou heart of gold, why hast thou not written for such a long time to thy sorrowing little dove, Teresa? I nearly burst out laughing. A sorrowing little dove, more than 5 feet high, with fists a stone and more in weight, and a face as if a little dove had lived all its life in a chimney and had never once watched itself. Restraining myself somehow, I asked, Who is this Bolesk? Bowles, Mr. Student, she said as if offended with me for blundering over the name. He is Bowles, my young man. Young man? Why are you so surprised, sir? Cannot I, a girl, have a young man? She, a girl? Well. Oh, why not, I said. All things are possible. And has he been your young man long? 6 years. Oh, I thought. Well, let us write your letter. And I tell you plainly that I would willingly have changed places with this Bowles if his fair correspondent had not been Teresa, but something less than she. I thank you most heartily, sir, for your kind services, said Teresa to me with a curtsy. Perhaps I can show you some service, eh? No, I most humbly thank you all the same. Perhaps, sir, your shirts or your trousers may want a little mending? I felt that this mastodon in petticoats had made me grow quite red with shame, and I told her pretty sharply that I had no need whatever of her services. She departed. A week or two passed away. It was evening. I was sitting at my window, whistling and thinking of some expedient for enabling me to get away from myself. I was bored. The weather was dirty. I didn't want to go out, and out of sheer ennui I began a course of self-analysis and reflection. This also was dull enough work, but I didn't care about doing anything else. Then the door opened. Heaven be praised! Someone came in. Oh, Mr. Student, you have no pressing business, I hope. It was Teresa. Humph. No, what is it? I was going to ask you, sir, to write me another letter. Very well. To Bowles, then? No, this time it is from him. What? Stupid that I am. It is not for me, Mr. Student. I beg your pardon. It is for a friend of mine. That is to say, not a friend, but an acquaintance. A man acquaintance. He has a sweetheart just like me here, Teresa. That's how it is. Will you, sir, write a letter to this Teresa? I looked at her. Her face was troubled. Her fingers were trembling. I was a bit fogged at first, and then I guessed how it was. Look here, my lady. There are no Bowleses or Teresas at all, and you've been telling me a pack of lies. Don't you come sneaking around me any longer. I have no wish whatever to cultivate your acquaintance. Do you understand? And suddenly she grew strangely terrified and distraught. She began to shift from foot to foot without moving from the place, and sputtered comically, as if she wanted to say something and couldn't. I waited to see what would come of all this, and I saw and felt that, apparently, I had made a great mistake in suspecting her of wishing to draw me from the path of righteousness. It was evidently something very different. Mr. Student, she began, and suddenly, waving her hand, she turned abruptly toward the door and went out. I remained with a very unpleasant feeling in my mind. I listened. Her door was flung violently to. Plainly, the poor wretch was very angry. I thought it over and resolved to go to her and, inviting her to come here, write everything she wanted. I entered her apartment. I looked round. She was sitting at the table, leaning on her elbows, with her head in her hands. "Listen to me," I said. Now, whenever I come to this point in my story, I always feel horribly awkward and idiotic. Well, well. "Listen to me," I said. She leaped from her seat, came toward me with flashing eyes, and laying her hands on my shoulders, began to whisper, or rather to hum in her peculiar bass voice. "Look you now, it's like this. There's no Bolus at all, and there's no Teresa either. But what's that to you? Is it a hard thing for you to draw your pen over paper, eh? Ah, and you too, still such a little fair-haired boy. There's nobody at all, neither Bolus nor Teresa, only me. There you have it, and much good may it do you." "Pardon me," I said, altogether flabbergasted by such a reception. "What is it all about? There's no Bolus, you say?" "No, so it is." "And no Teresa either?" "And no Teresa. I'm Teresa." I didn't understand it at all. I fixed my eyes upon her and tried to make out which of us was taking leave of his or her senses. But she went on to the table, searched about for something, came back to me, and said in an offended tone, "If it was so hard for you to write to Bolus, look, there's your letter. Take it. Others will write for me." I looked. In her hand was my letter to Bolus. Phew! "Listen, Teresa, what is the meaning of all this? Why must you get others to write for you when I have already written it and you haven't sent it?" "Sent it where?" "Why, to this Bolus." "There's no such person." I absolutely did not understand it. There was nothing for me but to spit and go. Then she explained. "What is it?" she said, still offended. "There's no such person, I tell you," and she extended her arms as if she herself did not understand why there should be no such person. But I wanted him to be. Am I then not a human creature like the rest of them? Yes, I know, of course. Yet no harm was done to anyone by my writing to him that I can see. Pardon me, to whom? To Bolus, of course. But he doesn't exist. Alas, alas, but what if he doesn't? He doesn't exist, but he might. I write to him, and it looks as if he did exist. And Teresa, that's me, and he replies to me, and then I write to him again. I understood at last, and I felt so sick, so miserable, so ashamed somehow. Alongside of me, not 3 yards away, lived a human creature who had nobody in the world to treat her kindly, affectionately, and this human being had invented a friend for herself. Look now, you wrote me a letter to Bolus, and I gave it to someone else to read it to me, and when they read to me, I listened and fancied that Bolus was there. And I ask you to write me a letter from Bolus to Teresa, that is, to me. When they write such a letter for me and read it to me, I feel quite sure that Bolus is there, and life grows easier for me in consequence. Deuce take you for a blockhead, I said to myself when I heard this. And from thenceforth, regularly, twice a week, I wrote a letter to Bolus, and an answer from Bolus to Teresa. I wrote those answers as well. She, of course, listened to them and wept like anything, roared, I should say, with her bass voice. And in return for my thus moving her to tears by real letters from the imaginary Bolus, she began to mend the holes I had in my socks, shirts, and other articles of clothing. Subsequently, about 3 months after this history began, they put her in prison for something or other. No doubt by this time she is dead. My acquaintance shook the ash from his cigarette, looked pensively up at the sky, and thus concluded. Well, the more a human creature has tasted of bitter things, the more it hungers after the sweet things of life. And we, wrapped round in the rags of our virtues, and regarding others through the mist of our self-sufficiency, and persuaded of our universal impeccability, do not understand this. And the whole thing turns out pretty stupidly, and very cruelly. The fallen classes, we say, and who are the fallen classes, I should like to know. They are, first of all, people with the same bones, flesh and blood and nerves as ourselves. We have been told this day and after day for ages, and we actually listen, and the devil only knows how hideous the whole thing is. Or are we completely depraved by the loud sermonizing of humanism? In reality, we also are fallen folks, and so far as I can see, very deeply fallen into the abyss of self-sufficiently in the conviction of our own superiority. But enough of this. It's all as old as the hills, so old that it is a shame to speak of it. Very old indeed. Yes, that's what it is. The end. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a good week.